So before I jump in, I just want to let everyone know that the document that I'm referring to today, the summary of the emerging themes from the Listen and Learn sessions, is attached to the meeting announcement, but I just posted it also in the Zoom chat box. So if you don't have it, that's probably the easiest way for you to get it rather than navigating a bunch of links. So thanks everyone for joining today. Basically what I'm going to do is take you through a summary of what we heard from 4 listening sessions that IARPC held in conjunction with ARCUS over the past few months. And Janet Warburton is also here and has been a lead on this. So Janet, as I'm going through, if you have stuff to add or anything, just unmute and jump in, and yeah, that'd be great. So a little bit of background on this is that it is a part of the IARPC Arctic STEM Collaboration Team Initiative, or as a part of this initiative, IARPC initiated a workshop to examine and address the need for greater engagement and participation of rural and Alaska Native undergraduate youth in Arctic STEM programs. And as a part of a lead up and in preparation for this workshop was to hold a series of listening sessions that ARCUS in conjunction with IARPC held between January and April. And the purpose of these sessions was to solicit input from interested and effective groups. So we heard from students themselves, from teachers, community members, program PIs, other folks who run programs, and people who are just interested in Arctic STEM or have experience in some capacity in conducting Arctic STEM programs. And the input that we collected from these sessions is going to be used to guide and inform a more formal invite-only workshop, which originally was going to be held in April. That's been pushed back now because of COVID, and I think we'll talk a little bit more about the workshop later, and we can give you some more details about that, as well as some updates on when it's going to happen and how it's going to happen. So just a little bit of context, the scope of the term STEM programs for this effort was intentionally left pretty broad to include things like STEM degree programs, STEM internships or workforce experiences, research apprenticeships, or summer research programs. It was kept broad intentionally, but I do have to say that as our sessions and conversations developed, I think there was sort of a natural focus on summer programs that emerged. So I'm just saying that so you keep that in mind. The intent was not to exclusively focus on summer programs, but a lot of the input we got seemed to assume that. So that's just a little bit of context. So I'm going to walk you through what we heard in these sessions, but I'm hoping this can be a little bit more of a discussion of some of the results, and as also any additional recommendations that any of you have for things that should be considered in the workshop. So rather than me just reading through everything we found, let's have a conversation about it. But I will take you through the main themes just to get you, or to get everybody thinking and ready for the discussion. So first, a little bit about the process behind the document. We had 4 sessions in total. One was held at the Alaska Marine Science Symposium, which was held in January. 2 sessions were held at the Alaska Forum on the Environment in February, and then 1 was held via teleconference in April with students from the Alaska Native and Science and Engineering program in Fairbanks. So each session was structured a little bit differently in terms of the questions that were asked, but in all of the sessions, except for the ANSEP one, participants broke into small groups and used sticky notes to contribute ideas. So they sort of moved around in small groups to give input. And then we held a group discussion on the input, as well as address anything that was missing. So we had a facilitator who did a really great job at leading these discussions and getting everybody talking. And then this input was distilled into themes, which is the document that you hopefully have and are looking at. And the input under each theme is very close to what was written down on these sticky notes. We just adjusted it for clarity. And then in a lot of cases, people wrote similar things down. So if there was 5 sticky notes that were pretty much saying the exact same thing, that was just turned into 1 point so that we weren't you're not reading through a bunch of the same stuff. So very quickly, like I said, I'm gonna walk you through the themes, and we can use that as sort of a lead in to any questions that you all have in a larger discussion. So the first theme that came out of these sessions was the cost benefit of participating in programs. So people talked about how programs and people who are leading these programs really need to evaluate the cost benefit of participating in programs, not just for the students and the participant, but also for their community, both financially and otherwise, and then make adjustments to these programs accordingly. So this refers to things like making sure that students receive competitive funding but usually academic credit for participating in programs. And then understanding that students don't necessarily have the ability to provide upfront costs and get reimbursed later. And they're maybe doing this program in place of a more high paid job to support themselves and their family. So just keeping these things in mind and doing what you can to adjust the program. And the issue of students not being able to provide upfront costs came up quite a bit, and students felt like often programs ask them to pay for the plane ticket or housing, and then they get reimbursed at the end of the summer. And that's not really possible in a lot of cases. The second theme was accessibility and ensuring that programs are accessible to the demographic that you're really seeking to attract and engage. So thinking about the location of programs as well as their timing and length. So a lot of students in particular said that a lot of programs take place all summer, and that's a really important time to be also at home and participating in things like subsistence hunting. So that was a conflict that they couldn't necessarily spend the entire summer in a program, but also considering the requirements that programs have. So when recruiting, considering more than just GPA, but also things like some students talked about how they really wished that their community service was taken into account for programs, and that they could provide things like not just academic reference letters, but letters of community support, and having face-to-face conversations with program managers and PIs or whoever, just to sort of develop that relationship and that being a part of access to these programs. The third theme was relevance and making programs and projects relevant to place and community interests and needs. So relevance in terms of the content of programs, the examples that get used throughout the programs, and also the skills that get taught. So, really showing how the skills that are being taught are going to be beneficial to students later on. And something that also came up quite a bit was understanding, taking the time to understand why students are interested in the program and where they want it to lead them. So understanding what students' longer term goals are and the student's definition of success, and then helping them achieve it, and understanding that it might not be the same metrics to which the program is being evaluated by. Like their goals might not be to continue on to a PhD. It might be to return to their community and get a job there that's in service and can help their community. The next theme was community engagement and ensuring honest, respectful, and consistent engagement with the communities that students are coming from. So people talked a lot about considering the whole community and family when engaging a student, and honoring a student's existing STEM knowledge, which may come from not formal education necessarily, but a lot of students from rural Alaska have a wealth of STEM knowledge that can be incorporated into programs, and being inclusive of communities in curriculum building, in program execution, and committing to long-term or longer-term engagement with students and their communities. Long-term and post-program engagement. So engaging students both before and after the program. So people talked about having students who have participated in programs being a part of outreach efforts to younger students, and helping to advertise to younger students so that students know what opportunities are ahead of them and have a chance to start preparing for those opportunities. And then importantly, to help students obtain their next opportunity, whatever that might be, to help keep them engaged in STEM. Funding came up, ensuring adequate funding for not only students, but also for the programs themselves. I thought this was a really interesting conversation that came up with one of the groups I was in, was that students, or not just students, but this was more PIs, talked about how programs are often only funded for a couple years, and it takes a long time to build engagement and work to sort of establish a name for a program and get students engaged. And if you're relying on older students to engage younger students, it just takes sometimes longer than these projects get funded for. And also, I thought it was interesting. One student talked a lot about, she was very interested in where funding came from, and sort of raised the point that if funding's coming from outside of Alaska, how do we ensure that these funding agencies know what our priorities are? But then if funding's coming from inside of the state, how do we ensure that it's not subject to sort of political tribulation and winds and changes? So sort of there was the overarching theme of stable and long-term funding. Outreach and recruitment, conducting targeted and community-based in-person outreach and recruitment when you're recruiting students. So beginning outreach early, advertising in places, not just schools, but community centers, recreation centers, anywhere that students or mentors may go and see them. And also working with schools and communities to ensure that students are aware of opportunities, but also so that they have the resources or people who can help them apply to these programs, have that support. Mentoring was a big one, prioritizing mentorship before, throughout, and post-program. So really mentorship needing to be front and center. And we heard a lot of recommendations for different kinds of mentorship, including having elders as mentors or community members as mentors, or a co-mentor, for example, perhaps connecting younger students to older students and having older students be mentors, and also considering the different kinds of support that students need. So these might be things that fall outside of traditional mentorship, but maybe some other forms of support that students need to be successful and to continue on with these programs. And then finally, partnerships, connecting and partnering with community organizers and employers. So just making sure that agencies or programs are connecting with communities and organizations and communities. And then one student I thought was a cool idea, was to connect a lot of the different STEM programs, particularly ones that have a focus on increasing engagement with Alaska Native and rural Alaskan students, and create kind of a community of STEM, a little bit virtually in this case, but just lots of different ideas of how to connect across programs and organizations. So that was a little longer than I intended, but my hope now is first to answer any questions you have, if you need any clarifications, but to hear from all of you on these themes, as well as any additional thoughts or insights you might have. And yeah, just have a conversation about what we've heard. So thank you for listening to me. And Janet, feel free to jump in if I've missed anything, or if you think there's anything else that needs to be said before we jump into the discussion.
Thanks, Serena, for your presentation. I just posted a couple of things in chat in case you didn't see them. Just a little bit about background about the process. We do have a steering committee and a facilitator that's on contract to help us through this. So it's just not Serena and Janet coming up with this whole thing. And also there is a website that's associated with it. So that's all in the chat.
Thanks, Janet.
So I have a question. I said I was just going to be in listening mode, but I'll ask. So I had not seen the document until you just shared it, and so I've just looked at it really quickly. So I guess I'm it seems like everything there is a pathway to an end, but but there's no definition of what the endpoint is, or what you know, is the endpoint to try and get students into college, or is it to try and just have students graduate with a strong STEM background, or what is the objective of the effort?
Yeah, well, that's a good question, and I will also let Lisa and Kaya jump in with their perspectives, but I'll start out. And I think the you know, it's really multi-pronged. It's to have students graduate, underrepresented students graduate in STEM fields, and from my perspective, enter into STEM careers and fields, specifically in the Arctic, where those fields are growing very quickly. And there's not a lot of representation from Alaska Native and rural Alaskan demographics in these opportunities. So to create that capacity for the Arctic region, and for Alaska in general. So to, you know, make sure the opportunities are there, and then provide pathways for students who are interested. And for some students that might be going on to PhD programs, but for some students, it might be graduating and getting a job in STEM in their communities. So I think it really comes down to you know, the students, and then making sure the opportunities are there for them and that capacity is being built. But I think, I don't know if Lisa or Janet, you have a little bit more background for the.
So
But that is a good answer, though, I'll say.
It is, and you're correct in that this whole effort grew out of a meeting we had here of some of the federal agency program officers who sponsor programs in Alaska. And we were talking about our recruitment efforts and realized that we're just not reaching a lot of Alaskan students. And we were trying to figure out why that might be and what we could do to try to create programs that actually work for students in Alaska. Because if we're funding programs in Alaska that mainly attract students from the lower 48, you know, we would like to have students from Alaska participate. So that's how it got started. And the idea is that maybe we need to reinvent the wheel. I mean, not reinvent the wheel, reinvent our concept of how we're running these programs. And what really struck me, what came out of this was that a lot of our programs do run in the summer, and that's just not a good time for a lot of these students. And so what can we do about that? I think there are certainly a number of things we can try moving forward that I don't know if they'll work, but we can change the timing for sure. Well, maybe we can change the timing. We can try to. So, and see if that helps. So things like that. How do we create programs? Because if we're not going to engage them in our programs, that they won't go into STEM necessarily. And so the idea is to create something that will engage these students that we have not been able to reach until now.
My only concern was, you know, you can't really measure success unless you know what you're trying to achieve. Right.
Well, I think the different agencies have different goals, but speaking for the National Science Foundation, we would certainly like students to be go into undergraduate STEM programs. But that you have to assume that the more, if you engage a lot of students, that maybe some of them will do that.
Mm-hmm.
That's my thinking.
I had a question, a twofold question. Have you talked, or in those sessions, did you get any information of what type of areas students in rural communities are interested in particular? And what's your take on the long-term funding opportunities? Like, when I went to UAF in Alaska, and oftentimes the problem was that, as you said before, Sorina, the funding is just not there, and a student from a rural community just can't afford flying to Fairbanks and living there for the semester to take classes, which is why the rural community campuses are so important. So I'm curious what your take is on that, and especially in the current administration, and whether we'll be able to protect those campuses so students in rural communities can still attend classes.
Yeah. So in terms of topics, we didn't have too much of a focus on the kinds of topics that students wanted to be engaged in, but I will say that a lot of people brought up existing STEM knowledge and skills that students from these areas have through the way they were raised and through community knowledge and practice. So a lot of that was centered around subsistence hunting, fishing, gathering, and some of the biology and different STEM disciplines involved in that, and an eagerness to have that knowledge both recognized and on equal footing in these programs. So not as sort of a addition or add-on, but really as a part of a program. So I think you could make some assumptions from that some of the topics, but I'm trying to recall I don't know if Janet, you can remember if any other sort of topics came up in terms of STEM. That was the one that resonated the most, or that I heard the most.
No, I don't think we didn't get to that level of detail. It was more, all the listen and learn sessions were just to gather information about their experiences and what they have, like you had already been through something. So how did that resonate with you? What worked, what didn't work? And then also, if it didn't work or it was working really well, how did you see that as a success, or what were the pitfalls of those experiences? And then kind of what Lisa was talking about earlier, if you could dream big and you had the ideal experience or opportunity, what would that look like for you coming from rural Alaska? So really, we were just gathering information, and I think the next piece on the agenda is kind of about how we're taking this information, and we're going to have this workshop, which kind of leads to what Larry was talking about. Where do you want to go from here? We're really just gathering ideas and guidance to give to others that are trying to fund these kinds of programs or looking for opportunities to engage. Or if you already have a program, how can you do it better and reshape it to really match the needs and, as Sorina said, the capacity of the participants and provide better opportunities. So really our goal with this particular funding is to address that initial need that people weren't being effective, or if they were, they weren't sure what the pitfalls were, or if they wanted to move on, how can they move on more strategically? And so we're trying to gather that information, come up with, have a working group of people, practitioners and people that are impacted and students, and then move forward with guidance. And hopefully it can, feed into all of these bigger issues along the way, but really quick. And that's, your other question was about funding and long-term funding and where that comes from. That's one of the questions. We don't have the answer.
Yeah, right. Yeah, go ahead, Gail.
Sorina, this is Kaya. I'm wondering if sorry, I don't mean to interrupt anybody, but it's hard to tell where the conversation is in the phone. I just wanted to come back to Larry's question about the endpoint for this. And I agree with Lisa's perspective of getting more students into STEM that come from rural Alaska or Alaska natives. And from a resource management perspective, in NOAA, we see very few rural or Alaska native students or people enter our workforce. So we are interested and engaged in this from that perspective, that how can we support the longitudinal aspects of education into the workforce. We engage significantly with resource issues in coastal Alaska that have a big connection to rural communities and Alaska Native interests in particular. And we are not necessarily serving those interests as well as we could without community members being part of our workforce. So that, I think, probably stands for a lot of resource agencies in Alaska. So where's the gap there? You know, why are we not seeing students from rural and Alaska Native backgrounds in the education system, as Lisa's pointing out? And then, you know, maybe that's a lead on to why we're not seeing those participants in the workforce. So looking at the longitudinal perspective, how can we address the pieces? And from NOAA's perspective, how can we facilitate greater participation of rural Alaska Natives in the NOAA workforce community so that we can better address the resource management needs that we have?
Thanks, Kaya. Can I also mention that, Margaret, you had something in the chat box. You want to expand on that? You're muted.
Yeah, I was just setting up. But yeah, for me, it's a bit different. It's not about trying to it's also part of this is rethinking a little bit about what kind of education these students might want. Because I think maybe part of the problem is that they don't want to go into a workforce or into a job that already exists, that it might be thinking about what kind of jobs and opportunities could be within their communities to serve their communities. And part of that, yeah, resource management, stuff like that, but that is also kind of this bigger picture of maybe thinking about changing Alaska itself to better fit the needs of villages. But that's kind of why I'm interested in, because I think, yeah, it's not just about supporting students to go into these Western defined boxes. It's also maybe thinking a little bit about how we change those boxes.
Yeah, I'll jump in and say I agree 1,000% with what you just said, Margaret. And I think that there are a lot of lessons that we can take from where SOCNAS, the Society for the Advancement of Chicanos and Hispanics and Native Americans in Science, some of the lessons that that society has learned along the way about engaging students in research experiences. And when we first started working with SOCNAS, we meaning the ocean science world, about 16 years ago, students were not applying for ocean science REUs from that community. It just wasn't happening. And so we spoke literally to hundreds of students trying to determine what were the barriers. And one of the biggest barriers was that in order to have these students get engaged, their families had to be engaged. And you mentioned that as one of the outcomes from your listening session. And so in terms of the application and recruitment process, I think having information sessions where families come, not just the students, and helping the families understand what this would mean to their children and what benefits their community would derive from their own children's participation. I think that's a really key take-home message. And then I'm just connecting some dots to this discussion and other discussions that I've been in over the last couple of months regarding the engagement of Indigenous communities in general. And one of the big messages I'm getting over and over is that we meaning we in the lower latitudes, keep coming with our research questions, our projects, wanting to engage these folks and provide them with opportunities, but we're not engaging them at the onset of how these projects are designed and what the research questions are that they would develop. And I think if the students and the families I and the communities could be assured that the research questions that their students would be addressing in research experience would be important to the communities, they might get more, you might get more buy-in. In other words, having co-development of research questions. If a student is interested in having a research experience, especially students from Native Alaskan communities, I think it's really important for them to co-develop what the research question is going to be addressed in their experience. It just can't serve Western science. You know, it has to relate to something in their community. And you did mention that you heard something like that in your listening session. So I think those two things could make a big difference. It did certainly in Saknas make a difference when we started trying to make sure that students' families got information and we weren't just trying to reach out to families, to students.
Gail?
Hi,
so,
Johnny.
hi. And I want to second what you and Margaret just said as well. Having spent a few weeks on a ship last summer with Native indigenous Inuit people, we kind of had a gotten a feel for what makes them tick, what makes them excited about ocean science and or science in general, and how to engage them. And one of the key things that they brought to our attention is this idea of co-ownership of ideas and knowledge. And both sides, the research scientists as well as the indigenous Native community brings something to the table, working together, developing questions that is of interest to them as well as to the researchers from the lower 48. And there's that, at least in the Canadian Arctic, there's that a youth group called ICARVIC. I don't know if there's something comparable in the Alaska Arctic, where essentially youth taking leadership role and ownership of this learning process, of this knowledge development process, and interacting, working directly with the scientists. And when you see that they have they feel empowered and they're co-owner of this knowledge being developed, they're really engaged and they love to continue further. So I see that as a potential way forward to address, to getting more Native community engaged in future science, Arctic science.
Yeah. Thank you for bringing those things up. The reason why I asked about the interest of the communities was kind of geared to that as well. Because if you know what the communities want to know and want to get engaged in and what jobs they want to serve in either the community or somewhere else, then it might help target or develop certain workshops. And yeah, we had on the Asgard cruise with Seth Danielson from UAF, we had Native observers that would join the cruise and they thought it was a really great experience. So I think even the research cruises and having like a spot on a research vessel is super valuable, and getting a Native, and then they don't even need to travel anywhere. They can literally just walk on the boat. So that, and it's only 4 weeks. So maybe that'll take away from that time commitment as well.
Isn't that almost required to have Native observers on a lot of these cruises nowadays?
Yeah, you're supposed to, but not all of them have space or have a Native observer.
Hi, I wanted to weigh in from the Arctic Data Center perspective. The repository side of things, and what I'm really trying to work on is creating a space, a skill building hub essentially, where students can go in and look at data from their communities, or hopefully. I'm very curious in learning how we can better support these students from a space in their own home without necessarily having to go onto a research vessel or anything like that. And I'm not really sure, I wanted to hear any thoughts that you might have on, is this something that would be included into maybe a curriculum, or how can we best support and make sure that students have access to all this data that's already existing on their communities in the Arctic?
Well, I think you should ask them what data they would like to see, right? Instead of you just, creating data sets for them to use, it's really important to find out what data they are interested in looking at before you start developing data sets or activities for them to use, right? It's important to engage them from step one.
Exactly.
And so they'll tell you what they'd like to learn about their communities.
Yeah, just to kind of like reorient that. So we're not creating data sets, they're submitted through the NSF researchers. Yeah, so I don't have that much control on what's submitted, but definitely starting from the beginning, and I totally agree.
Well, you do have control about which data you're going to use in your activities though. So if you let them know what data is available, they can then say, well, yeah, we'd be interested in that data set.
Okay.
Yeah,
definitely.
I wanted just to go back to one more thing about getting students to even be interested to participate. And this, again, goes back to lessons that we learned through our work with SACNAS. We were really surprised that students would not be allowed by their families to apply for internships or research experiences or other kinds of programs like that if it was more than 50 miles from home. And that seemed to be a really big limiting factor. Families wanted to know that they could get in the car and drive and find their child in an hour or so if need be. And so I'm just wondering, there are nodes, in various communities. You did mention that. And if you really want to start getting numbers, maybe the experiences should happen in the communities instead of taking the students out of the community to some other place. It's really tough. And that's still and SACNAS is finding that's still an obstacle to students applying for REUs.
Actually, Larry, that brings up a question that maybe you could answer for us. And, the closest thing to a lot of these communities are maybe some of the local community colleges. There aren't that many of them, but and there's the tribal college in Utgavik. So are those going to be closed? Are they open? What's the status?
They're open and they're going to remain open. So so yes, they will remain open. There's a lot of discussion right now about actually merging the community colleges into. We have let's see, how do I say this? They're separated. Some are managed through the tribal colleges, so the Utgavik, and then there's the Alaska Pacific is a tribal college now, and then there's community colleges under the University of Alaska Fairbanks and under UAA in Anchorage, and then under UAS in Southeast. So the structure may change, but the community colleges will definitely remain open, and there will be some structure to them. I don't think that the tribal colleges will not be merged with the community colleges because they are independent. That's a good thing. But that I think the discussion this morning has been really good for me, in that there's a lot of different objectives, a lot of different purposes for this. And so the community colleges won't meet a lot of the goals that are being set forth as far as, giving students a STEM background doesn't necessarily require a community college education. And so I think, I think one thing this pandemic has really brought forward is that there's a lot of needs that are not being met right now, just because the travel to rural communities has been stopped. And so, one of the issues that we've had is just that, the communications between Kotzebue and the outside has been essentially really hurt because some of the equipment is down and the technicians cannot travel there to repair it. And so without those local skills, you know, that's a real impediment to the whole community. And also just, I guess, you know, forgive me, I'm sorry, I can't remember who said this, but as far as the, you know, the needs of actually, I think it was Gail said this, as far as the, when you were talking about the Hispanic students, the needs of the students in the community are not necessarily aligned with Western science, and that is correct. But there are a lot of opportunities that Western science and research can bring to the communities, as far as if we engage students, young students in research and have them being a part of it, then that absorption of STEM science can be picked up without actually going through the community college route, or the traditional education mechanisms. And this pandemic is really hurting us, as far as our Western research is just essentially stopped right now in a lot of the rural communities. If we had better participation, better engagement, that could be maintained, could be continued. And I think the ARM program in Upyaugvik is just an excellent example of that. There are local technicians who are really, you know, that's still thriving and still not missing a beat, because they don't need outside researchers coming up there to keep that going. It's all being done locally. And if we had a better engagement in all our other programs, you know, this pandemic would not be hammering the research programs nearly as badly. But that's just one example, and I don't mean to say that that is certainly not the only purpose for a program such as this. And I'm sorry for going on so long.
What is the ARM program?
I'm sorry. So the ARM program is part of the Department of Energy. It's the atmospheric radiation measurements. And so it's really a highly technical measurements, but it's got wonderful local people who are operating it and maintaining it.
So in a sense, as educators, having to teach remotely during this pandemic, it really makes us appreciate what does it take to be successful at teaching and learning from students' perspective remotely. And in order to reach some of these remote communities where students want to stay home, close to their families, and not to have incurred the expense of travel, it's almost like we're learning how to do that, forced to do so through this pandemic. So there's another side to this coin. And I do see a lot of this lessons learned during this time will stay for higher education, even in the lower 48. So if you step forward a few years, maybe 2 or 3 years, and you have maybe the Starlink satellite system up running all over the globe, and you have high-speed internet access throughout the Arctic, then some of these lessons learned now can be applied when we have access to each home, to each student, when they needed to, and they feel more included and be more part of this learning community, less global, not just where they are. And you mean and maybe summertime is bad, but maybe in the wintertime where there's a lot of social issues that, and maybe being part of a greater learning community and feeling engaged is part of those solutions as well. So, yeah.
Hi, this is Maida. I just wanted to offer a faculty perspective. I'm currently based out of Iowa, actually community college, but previously I taught at UAA with a dual appointment with anthropology and Alaskan Native Studies, and then before that I did a postdoc out on the East Coast where I also worked with Alaskan Native students. So throughout the various courses, and these were introductory and advanced as well, a lot of the common theme that came up from students who wanted to be engaged in research, Alaskan Native students, whether in the lower 48 or in urban Alaska, was the desire to be part of a project that focuses on Alaskan Native issues during the semester, because that helped them keep grounded, helped them being connected with their Alaskan Native background, regardless whether it was actually focusing on their communities or another Alaskan Native community. So being part of internships during the summer, which, as I think Lisa mentioned, can be very limited because we are talking about fishing and other obligations that they have to their families when they go home. Being actively engaged in projects during the semester with the faculty is something that actually also helps with retention of students coming from rural communities. And I feel like all of these summer programs and internships, somebody needs to connect students, just like all other undergraduate students. There needs to be a faculty who needs to connect students with these opportunities. And so there's this previous step that is really on faculty who can create these projects where they teach them how to do research and then help with them to develop their own research areas, or what is it that they interested in their communities. Because another theme that came up for most of the students, the desire to do well in their school environment, but also to be able to represent what they're doing in school to their communities. And so there's this kind of concern that whatever that they are doing in school will be something that their communities will be also happy for and later can use, and so they can contribute to their communities through their education.
Thank you. I just wanted to let you guys know that we have about 8 minutes left of the scheduled time, and there's still the rescheduling the workshop agenda, although on the agenda. So we will
Thanks,
move
Anne.
on.
Kaya, are you still on? Can you address that?
Yes, I am. Thanks everybody for your thoughts and contributions on the listen and learn sessions. As Sorina said, initially our idea was to have these listen and learn session information contribute to a workshop environment in coming up with ideas and recommendations for Arctic STEM, and in particular for further engaging rural and Alaska Native students in Arctic STEM. So because of the COVID, we had to cancel the April timeframe, and we're looking at rescheduling the workshop in the fall sometime. We have not yet figured that out entirely, and I think that'll be a little bit in play as things evolve. But we will be posting notifications on the IARPC collaboration team website, so you can check that for information about the workshop. We do have a restricted participant capacity, but if you have a particular interest and you have some ideas that you'd like to contribute, please reach out to either Sorina, myself, or Lisa, and we will try to accommodate that. So keep an eye out for how we're progressing with scheduling the workshop.
Yeah, and I think a decision, the steering committee will be making more of a decision about how to proceed in July too. So keep an eye out around that time. We can send an update out mid-July.
Right. This is an evolving effort. So we're all trying to respond as we can. And lastly, we wanted to kind of go around the room and ask if there's anything that anyone wants to bring up.
I don't really have anything to bring up, but I just really found this conversation really interesting and fascinating, and I'm really excited about finding a way to bring data sets to the community. I would love if anyone has any thoughts or perspectives on reaching out to these Indigenous communities, our Arctic universities. I'd love to have a conversation and just get this ball rolling on how I can better serve this community in particular.
Thanks, Sarah. I would just note that there are a couple of other groups within IARPC that are often talking about this topic, and I can try to send you an email with some of that information after the meeting.
And I would say that there are a couple programs at NSF that we're certainly going to be very interested in online learning from now on. One of them is called Improving Undergraduate STEM Education, IUSE, and that is run out of our Education Directorate. And I'm a program officer. I'm affiliated there, even though I'm on the science side of the house. But the other one is called GeoPath, GeoPath, and that's out of our Geosciences front office, Director of Geosciences. And I can help you if you're interested in any of those programs, but that's a good place to start if you're thinking about creating online projects for students.
Fantastic. Thank you so much.
You're welcome. All right. Any more thoughts from anyone last minute?
Thanks, everyone.
Okay, well, thank you. This was a great conversation. Larry, thank you for joining us. That was nice to see you. And I'm glad you've taken over the reins at OSTP. Are you going to be working remotely or?
Well, until they go back to work, I'll be working from Fairbanks. But,
okay,
but
great.
I'm anxious to get out there, and it was wonderful meeting everybody. So many of you I know, but it's great to see everybody.
Great. Well, hopefully we'll see you here in the area at some point. Okay. Well, thank you, everyone, and we'll
thanks, everyone.
We'll let you know when the next meeting is as well. Thank you.
Okay. Thanks all.
Thanks,
Bye-bye.
Dan. Thanks, Hazel.
Sure.